morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. These are extraordinary times, and we are fortunate to have not just Carolyn Fairbairn, the Director General of the CBI, helping us try to understand what the implications are of these latest changes on business, but the Shadow Chancellor, Annelies Dodds. Annelies, thank you so much. I know it's been an incredibly busy week with Labour Conference and with the changes that have been announced. We really appreciate you making the time to be here. As you may know, what we do with these calls generally is to try to firstly get a sense of what the CBI is hearing, what Carolyn's hearing in conversations with number 10, number 11, BEIS and other parts of government, but also what business is saying. And so I'm going to come to Carolyn first, and then I hope open up a conversation and think a little about what the economic impacts are of what we heard last night and what needs to be done to help business get through it. As always, the best thing I should say about these calls is that we get to actually hear from businesses how they're dealing and what's on their mind. So in the course of the conversation, Annelies, I'll try and make sure that I weave in as many questions and points that I hear from CBI members. And with that in mind, please do just raise any points or any thoughts you've got. If you want to do it anonymously, just say so, and we'll respect that, of course. I should have said I'm James Harding, I'm the editor of Tortoise, and we've been delighted to work with the CBI to try and understand the pressures and drivers as we all get through this. But Carolyn, good morning. I'm going to try and ask this in as sunny a way as possible, but I'm not sure the answer is going to be particularly sunny. What are the implications of what's been announced in the last 24 hours?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, good morning, everybody. We were due to be in Liverpool with the Labour Party conference. We're not, but we are delighted to be joined by Annelies today, and at a very important time. I mean, gosh, hard to sugarcoat yesterday's announcements. They were, I think, very challenging for individuals, and they're very challenging for business. The reaction of business, I mean, I spoke to many members yesterday. There is real understanding that getting the infection rate down has to be the #1 priority, because we must avoid a second lockdown. The most devastating thing of all would be that. So I think understanding of the need for new measures, but they are a crushing blow for thousands of firms. So I've spoken to quite a few in the hospitality industry. The 10 p.m. curfew is genuinely difficult. It can sound trivial on paper, but if it's the difference between a first and a second sitting, we've got a lot of firms out there looking at their survival with serious anxiety. You also have the go back to working from home if you can. When we were just beginning to see our city centres come back to life, you know, the bustle was coming back. I've been working in our London offices for these last 3 weeks. It was just starting. We've gone into reverse. And just to kind of recap what we heard yesterday, the 10 p.m. curfew starting tomorrow, the back to working from home, new face covering requirements and much stricter enforcement. I think we are going to see those fines being enforced. And similar measures across the devolved nations, although again, as we've often talked about on this call, some quite significant differences. Scotland has gone further, so they have banned mixing of households. I think we may have to move to that in England, although seriously hope not. Wales have called for non-essential journeys to be avoided, and while Northern Ireland have a ban on households mixing indoors. So a somewhat mixed picture, but everybody moving in the same direction. I have to say, James, I could hear the collective intake of breath when the Prime Minister said 6 months. I mean, that was a real shock, actually, in the middle of that speech. He said perhaps 6 months, but nonetheless, it was 6 months. And I think in some ways, I think that is helpful. I think to have a timetable like that enables businesses and individuals to plan. But gosh, I think that does just underline the seriousness of the situation. And in terms of our reaction, you might have seen some of what we have said overnight, but getting those business support schemes out has now become desperately, desperately urgent. And if there's a real disappointment yesterday, and I'll be frank about this, is that they weren't rolled out together. I mean, what we have learned from experience is that what businesses need to hear, alongside the restrictions, is what the support packages are going to be. And we currently have a complete cliff edge at the end of October with the JRS disappearing overnight. And that has now become, I think, a cry of real concern across the business community. So we have been working with the Treasury. We proposed a very clear, and actually for the CBI, we don't actually often put something on the table that's as defined as this, but we thought it was very important this time we did it. We put a suggestion around a part-time working scheme that actually I think shares many things in common with what Labour has been saying, which would echo some of what the German scheme does, but actually we think would be better, that has a 50% employee contribution for hours worked, and above that is split a third, a third, a third. We can talk more about that if that would be helpful. But we don't think that's enough, actually. We do think there has to be more cash flow support. I have described, our chief economist too has described deferral of VAT, Q2 VAT payments as being a no-brainer now. We just should do it. We campaigned very hard, private conversations with Rishi back in March, to do that for Q1. We should do it for Q2. We should extend the business rates holiday. That is cash. And this is a moment when cash is absolutely king. And then the final leg of this, James, in terms of what we want to see, it's kind of right here, right now, is a real national effort around mass testing, because that is going to be how we can bring the 6-month timetable forward. But I just think this is a really serious moment. It could have been worse. You know, there could have been moves towards national lockdown. We didn't see that. But now we really need those business support schemes within days, actually. I mean, it's become desperately urgent.
Carolyn, thank you. I think in the course of the conversation between now and 11:15, let's try and use this time to go into some of those things in detail. Annelise, I don't know whether not everyone on the call for their sins will have either heard or read your whole conference speech. So I think it would be useful to go through some of those things, particularly as Carolyn is saying, around those two big areas, you know, employee support and business support, not least for companies who face debts coming due in the spring of next year. You know, you had a lot to say on that. Shall we start there? What you think is now required of the Chancellor and the government, given the announcements that were made last night?
Yeah, absolutely, and really pleased to be on this call, and I'd want to pay tribute first of all to the CBI for all of the work that's been done, all of that engagement, and indeed to all the members who are on the call today, because I fully recognise everything that Carolyn's described about the very, very difficult times that businesses are going through, and so yeah, really looking forward to the rest of the discussion. I mean, specifically around the need for support now. We share the concerns that were just articulated. We believe that as public health measures are introduced, new ones, we need to surely have calibrated with that announcements around economic support. We didn't have it when the initial lockdown was brought in. There was a lag. We didn't have it when localised lockdowns were brought in. Again, there was a lag and there was confusion about how support would be provided. Really, we need to get better at this, because the problem is that I think a lot of businesses will have looked at those new restrictions announced last night, and whatever confidence might have been building up as it felt like we were perhaps getting to a better place will have been knocked back, and they need to know that there will be some support there to help get them through this additional period. I mean, we'll probably go on to talk about this, but you know, obviously as an opposition, we don't want to dilute any of those messages. We think a very problematic issue in the UK has been around communication and making sure that's got right. So we are backing those new restrictions because we want the communication to be clear. We want everyone to know exactly what government's setting out around how behaviour needs to change and what we all need to do. But we do think the economic support has got to be there. So obviously in my conference speech, I was saying that it needed to be there. And I've said it a number of times since, actually, just over the last few hours. We really do need to have that package coming forward now as soon as possible.
And Annelise, will you just talk us through, and Caroline, I'm going to ask you too, there are already questions coming in saying, can we just get into a little more detail of what the CBI's proposal on sort of JRS2 would look like? But Annelise, will you start first? In the conference speech, you outlined a targeted job recovery scheme and a job recovery scheme that asks certain things of the participating businesses, what do you have in mind?
Yeah, well, above all, we want government to be actually continuing and rapidly accelerating those discussions that it has already had with the CBI and the TUC and indeed a number of other associations as well. So I didn't set out a very complicated, fully articulated plan from Labour in my conference speech. The core thing that needs to happen is a programme to be put in place. We're not going to cavil over the exact details of it. That's not what we want as an opposition. But we do think, and in fact I've been urging this for many months, we do think that a targeted scheme is necessary. Why targeted? Because if we only, for example, had a scheme for those firms which still have restrictions applied to them, so for example in hospitality affected by the 10 p.m. close, etc., then actually we could be missing out some of those really critical sectors for the future of the UK economy that have been affected by reduced demand. Aerospace perhaps is one very evident one where we'll need that engineering capacity for the future of the UK economy, really big supply chains, impact on different communities, etc., but where if there was just an approach that said we should only have that wage support for sectors impacted by restrictions directly, we would be missing them out. So we want that discussion to have that kind of targeting. I suppose quite similar to what Carolyn mentioned there, we think that it should be enabling and encouraging part-time work, which would then be supported by government. We think that's important. And above all, that we end up in a situation where businesses are incentivised to have staff working part-time and then topped up by government, rather than having perhaps a reduced cohort working full-time and having to lay off large numbers of other workers. The critical problem that I'm concerned hasn't necessarily been fully grasped, although perhaps it is being now by central government, is that we can't, as a country right now, have that smooth transition out of heavily impacted sectors and into other jobs, because there isn't a perfect match there. I mean, we don't have high levels of vacancies coming through yet. The new positions that might exist are not in the places where people are losing their jobs. So I think sometimes it's suggested there's a trade-off between supporting people in work and getting those people who've become unemployed into new jobs. I don't think there's a trade-off at all, actually. I think we've got to work on both.
And just one thing before I come to Carolyn on this, Annalise, one of the elements of your proposal on the job recovery scheme is that, as well as being targeted around the businesses that need it, as well as being targeted at businesses who retain staff, and what you're also saying, and we will make sure that those companies treat their workers decently, have ambitions around net zero, and suspend dividend payments. So your approach would be that there should be a level of conditionality to that JRS2.
Forward-looking conditionality rather than backward-looking. We don't think that it would make sense, just as with the initial JRS, to be saying that because of kind of previous activity that employees should not be supported in the future. But actually, when I talk to a number of businesses, that would be pushing with the grain of what they want to see. I think we've got to face up to the fact that we have had some situations with the use of the JRS where, for example, we've had employees who've been informed that they must stop working at a particular point. They're not being paid, and then the redundancy payment has come out of the JRS. We don't think that practice is in line with the spirit of the scheme. In fact, the Chancellor said so himself, but there haven't been any mechanisms to prevent that from happening. So we do think with any new scheme that it needs to be really going with the grain of the kinds of good, positive business approach that I've seen from my discussions with a number of business owners and managers.
Okay. Karen, would you also just get a little into the detail of what the CBI proposal is?
Yeah, really happy to. And I think some of the principles we'd absolutely have in common with Labour. A few of them we might have a discussion over. But I think a core principle here is we are trying to protect viable jobs for the future. I think if a job is not going to stay the distance, then actually the fair and right thing to do for that employee is to retrain them and help them move into another sector. So we wanted to create a scheme that was about viable jobs for the future. So it is a part-time scheme, but we are saying that an employee who is going to receive a subsidy from the government needs to work at least 50% of their hours, and those will be paid by the employer. And then the remaining hours, which could be flexible depending on what the business needed, would be paid a third by the employer, government, and the employee. That there could be conditionality around dividend payments, but I think there is we need recognition that the more conditionality you put around it, the more bureaucracy you put around it, and the less easy you make it for businesses, many of whom are on the edge of survival, to access it. We do think it should be opened to all firms, not just those who have used the furlough scheme, because I think what's quite interesting is that we are hearing increasingly from businesses who are in the middle of supply chains. I mean, exactly as Annalise has said, there are some firms who've been completely left out of support schemes so far, who are beginning to face real problems because of flat demand. So we think it should be open to all schemes. And then the final point I would make is that the Treasury did introduce a job retention bonus at the end of January, which is for employees they have kept on £1,000 per employee retained. We think a business applying to this new scheme could choose one or the other, not both. And then the final thing would be, we think it should last a year, because actually one of the things that we've seen from international schemes that have been introduced or extended, they've given businesses some certainty around time frame. And we think, we don't know where all this is going. We could end up with greater restrictions. It's not going anywhere quickly. A year would be the right time frame. So those are the principles that we are proposed to the Treasury.
And Caroline, can I just ask you, are you worried about whether that's enough? Right? And forgive me, I'm slightly leading the witness here, but there are certainly concerns that these restrictions that have been announced are not where it ends. There might be more to come. Right? It's clearly going to have an impact on, if you're running a wedding or conference venue, right, you don't see any likelihood of your business coming back in any way for 6 months. A lot of non-essential retail is going to just see a colossal fall in footfall, these kinds of things. And the proposal that you've got assumes a decreased level of revenue. For lots of companies, there'll be none at all. So how do you support those businesses who are essentially seeing another 6 months of what we saw in the beginning of March?
Yeah. Well, I think this is where some of the cash relief needs to come in. That's where, just take away those cash costs to government at the moment, business rates, the VAT payments, take all that away. We also are hopeful that the CBILS lending scheme will be extended. That creates an opportunity for more lending, but it is going to need to be a package of things around cash relief and a job support scheme. But James, I'm going to be really honest on this call. We're not going to be able to protect every job. It is just not going to be possible to do that. And it is going to be very painful. We're not going to be able to avoid a rise in jobless figures. We've seen it already in the latest ONS numbers. But what we can do is put in place something that really is targeted on jobs we know to be viable in the future. So we've sought to strike that compromise, if you like, between that harsh recognition but preventing as much scarring as possible for the economy.
Annalise, can we talk a bit about that? Let's talk about unemployment and retraining. But in doing that, will you just also, one of the things you flagged up earlier this week was the question of companies facing debts coming due in the spring and what the government should do to help those companies, because I think it will have an impact, just to Caroline's point here, on their willingness to take on new debts now. So we touch on both of those things, debt and training.
Absolutely. Well, I did state in my conference speech that I think it's really important that government sets out a plan around these debt issues, particularly once the bounce back loans and other forms of lending that were delivered via the COVID-related schemes, once they start to become due for payment. We've got some of that happening from the end of March, actually, so really in quite short order. And there are interesting proposals which are out there, which government apparently has listened to, but it's not indicated which it's going to be using, if any. And we really said, look, we want to work with government on this and with bodies like the CBI, the TUC and others to work out a way through this. I mean, there's been, for example, from City UK, a suggestion that there could be a form of income contingent repayments for companies. Others have suggested that, you know, given that if government doesn't have some kind of creative approach to this, a lot of that debt is going to be written off and it's going to be a cost to the public purse. Perhaps there are creative ways of offering. There is one group, Social Enterprise UK, suggested a system of recovery credits, for example. You know, there are creative ways of looking into this, but what we're concerned about is that we could have kind of policy stasis for quite a long time, not any scheme being put into place, and then potentially a kind of panic reaction, you know, just coming up to the beginning of those repayments and maybe not fully thought through, not something that businesses were able to plan with. So, you know, it really does make sense to try and get this sorted out now. When it comes to training, we think that this is an area which really deserves much more emphasis and support. The government have already committed to £3 billion for a national skills strategy, which is meant to be delivered over a number of years. We've said, well, actually, right now is the time when we need, if we can build the capacity up big enough, and that is a big question, we need to be using that funding now, actually. We need to be building capacity in further education, adult education, and indeed in the job centre network, so that we can actually be linking people who are unemployed into those training opportunities. We also think, if you look at the German scheme of Kurzarbeit, it's not perfect, but there is an incentive within it for retraining for employers. We think that government should look at that. We think that is a sensible approach right now. And I suppose just finally, obviously, we've had that Kickstarter scheme announced by government. We were encouraging them to adopt such a scheme for young unemployed people, but we know that schemes like that and training and skills development work best when they're in conjunction with, you know, really strong local and regional networks of business associations, further education providers, trade unions, and so forth. So we don't want to have a kind of top-down approach here. We instead want to go with the grain of what's working locally. You know, the regional skills boards, really trying to ensure that they're properly resourced so that they can deliver that high-quality training and make sure that it's delivered by others.
And is there, and Annalise, one of the elements around training, of course, is the whole adult education as well as skills question. In fact, there's been a question here, is can the Shadow Chancellor expand specifically on that? Are you advocating a big overhaul of the existing adult education skills system? What do you think of that?
So I think in the middle of this crisis, big institutional change is not possible. So really we've got to try and use the structures that already exist. Now, in adult education and further education, that is a challenge because we've seen really quite a lot of reduction in capacity, particularly over the last 10 years. So, you know, to me, there is a big question about how we can get these systems to deliver at the scale that's necessary, but concentrating at least some of that resource, a large part of that resource now, trying to make sure that the systems are ready, I think would go quite a long way, actually. There are then longer term questions about the future of these areas. I think they need to have much more of a focus into the future. I know that Kate Green, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Education, agrees with me. And so that's something that we will be working on. But there's kind of immediate questions, I think, as well, that we need to get right.
Annalise, thanks. Caroline, I just want to play back to you a couple of things that people have said.
Yeah.
Partly just to feed back to you. It's also, one is someone wrote in to say, look, we would really struggle as a business to pay a third for staff not working and earning money. Hence, we most likely would continue with redundancy as a company. Our turnover is a third of the level pre-lockdown, with no idea when it will be back to future levels. And we're not even making enough to pay our running costs. So, I think there's going to be, I'm sure you've heard a lot of that. There were just two specific questions just to finish this section on JRS, Caroline. One was, have you got any sense of timings from Treasury? Do you say it's needed in the next few days. Do you think they're alive to that? And one person just asked, has the CBI looked at a sort of cost assessment of the scheme that you're proposing versus potential costs to the economy of big increases in unemployment?
Yeah. So first of all, and just to say, James, we absolutely hear it on this is not as generous as the furlough scheme. But I think what we've been trying to do is to, in a sense, really weigh up all of the different objectives for the economy, and just from the Treasury's point of view, the furlough scheme was genuinely unaffordable. I mean, I think we would in its pure blanket form. So and we absolutely hear that. On the timing of the scheme, I mean, we think the scheme actually will help hundreds of thousands of jobs. I mean, I think our scheme, we think will have a very significant take up. It does need to be very soon. So we already know we're within the 45-day redundancy notice. We've got hundreds of thousands of employees who've been served with redundancy consultation notices. We want to save a lot of those. There's nothing to say that those jobs have to be lost. They're in consultation. So we think it needs to be within days. Now, the Treasury are notoriously secretive. We don't know, and it's quite in many ways it's right, because this moves stock prices, it moves markets. The speculation is not helpful. But we would like to be seeing that white smoke coming out of Treasury within days. I mean, I think it's now absolutely there. And in terms of that cost, I think that's exactly what we've been trying to do, James, is to evaluate that trade-off between pain that we will need to take in some sectors that aren't going to be coming back quickly, and the retraining that Annalise talked about. I think we would support a lot of what she was saying there. We think regional support. We think our college and further education sector are ready to stand up and do much more. Many of them are members of ours, and we've been speaking to them about the opportunity to offer. One proposal we have in the spending review to the Chancellor is to make level 4 and 5 qualifications for young people totally free, and to enable a really big expansion of those skill levels, which are going to be so valuable going forwards. We need to be able to get on with that training and not protect jobs that aren't going to be here in a year's time. That is not the right a trade-off. So we think we've got it about right. Would really like to hear from members if they disagree or if they've got other ideas. We are constantly listening on this, but we have tried to really balance all of those different needs of the economy at this incredibly hard time.
Can I want to make sure we begin to do some sort of forward thinking, but can we just do one thing about right here and now, Carolyn and Annalise, which is, you mentioned, Carolyn, at the top, testing, right? And for so many companies, testing is going to determine how they operate, in fact, whether they can operate. Firstly, Carolyn, what's your read on where we are, current rationing of testing, the moonshot? What's your view of this?
I mean, it's clearly an incredibly difficult situation, and there appear to be a number of different bottlenecks in the system. Laboratory testing, I think, being one of the biggest. That we have, the test facilities able to process and actually test people. The laboratory is not able to keep up. There has been this huge increase in demand. I think two things I would say about what we think needs to happen next. I mean, first of all, our view is the government needs to breathe out. They breathed in terms of centralising, and this really is a moment to breathe out and to bring in the capacity that the private sector can offer, to bring in the universities and to become much more decentralised. And what we saw was real success earlier in the year. A national challenge around ventilators, around PPE. The CBI stepped in, so did the TUC, to really rally all parts of the economy, and it worked. We did not have a PPE shortage by the end of the summer. We did not have a ventilator shortage. We need the same thing on testing. And then in terms of the moonshot, it may not have been the best choice of language, but the idea that we should be testing for the negative. It's a completely different, turning it on its head, if you like, so that we could all, anybody who wanted to go to work could test negative, and then be able to go and work in a less socially distanced way, be able to live more normal lives. This is our plan B in case we don't get a working vaccine, and it should be given priority. And we thought the government were right to set out that ambition. The communications, as I say, may not have been right. We support it. And there is a lot of innovation, huge amount of innovation going on around a 15-minute test, very affordable, that could be rolled out at a great scale. And I'd add one final thing, James. One of the things I think that is a real shame at the moment is that we're having to make such hard trade-offs. For example, airport testing has gone to the back of the queue because of where we are. That is a tremendous blight on our economy. We are one of the most open economies in the world. We trade to our airports. I mean, holidays are one thing, and that's a sad loss. The impact on our economy is something I'm even more concerned about. And the sooner we can get an airport testing regime up and running, we think it can be done in a way that doesn't crowd out private NHS capacity. We should do it. So this has to be a collective effort, and it's really, again, really urgent.
Okay, Karen, thank you. Alice, do you want to comment on testing? Because I want to talk a little about your thoughts on partnerships with business, but do you want to comment on testing?
Yes, I mean, I agreed with just about everything that Carolyn said there. I've found this quite a frustrating time, actually. I'm talking to you from Oxford, where I know that there is incredible technological innovation going on. I mean, both around the vaccine, but around testing technology as well. And I am sure, and I know that we have the innovation in the UK to be able to deliver much of what is necessary. What's lacking, I think, is transparency around the logistical challenges of then delivering much of that, whether we're talking about the existing testing regime or about a future rapid testing regime. And I think the problem is that there's been without wanting to get too party political about this, I really don't want to, but there's been a kind of national level of communication that said, actually, the system is working well, there's nothing wrong with the system, stop criticising the system, but then that's bumped up against the experience of people on the ground. I think that's a problem. I always think openness and transparency around challenges helps to build trust. And just as Carolyn said, there does appear to be an issue around particularly the laboratory capacity. Obviously, locally here in Oxford, I've been talking to the universities, I've been talking to some of the companies actually involved with the testing side. I think we need to, really grasp those logistical challenges and get them sorted out. And it will come through that kind of decentralised process, I think, that Carolyn set out. I think that's what we need now. So I suppose as we're aware of the problems, let's not lose our ambitions and our hope that we can deal with them, because I know that British innovation can deal with those challenges. We just need to make sure that it's getting the appropriate logistics put to ensure that happens. I would just say, incidentally, these are also questions around vaccine delivery. Yes. As and when we do get a vaccine, and exactly the same issues potentially around bottlenecks, around delivery could arise. We need to be planning right now for that and not end up in a similar situation to what we're in around testing.
Well, in that spirit, Alice, can we talk a little bit about longer term thinking on business and the economy? I think even Inspector Clouseau would have spotted that there is a change in tone in conversations between a Labour shadow chancellor and the CBI and the members of the CBI and business more generally. But I think people are still unclear what of Corbyn era economic policy has been junked and what are the new Keir Starmer, Annalise Dodds plans for, I suppose, principally taxes and nationalisations. And I wondered whether, given the way you've talked about partnership with business, on those two in particular, you could just tell us a little of your thinking.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always say it, but it is true that actually we're all in a radically different situation to what we were in before. And I think many of the policy questions that arose previously have been put in a completely different framework because of the nature of this pandemic. So I think everything has to be reevaluated. That includes Labour Party policy, but obviously we have this system that, you know, some people on this call may be aware of, others won't necessarily. It's where we consult our members, we consult our different stakeholders, and then eventually present that programme to the public at the time of a general election. I mean, I think on those two issues that you mentioned in terms of our kind of immediate response, first of all, around taxation, I mean, I've made no bones of the fact that I do believe that we need to have a more progressive tax system in the UK, and also one which doesn't have so many anomalies in it. You know, I think currently the business rates regime in particular is very problematic. I don't think it supports local authorities in the way that it needs to, but I also don't think that it is right for business in many cases, particularly those businesses based on bricks rather than clicks, to put it in a rather banal way. So there are those long-term issues where there needs to be reform. But is right now the time to be engaged in those? I personally believe no. I am concerned that we've had some suggestions there could be changes to taxation occurring in the near future, which would then be removed and taxes cut before the next general election. So there could be a bit of a kind of bonanza on the government side. I really don't think that's helpful. I think, you know, we are in the middle of the deepest recession in 300 years. Now is the time to try and preserve the tax base, not to talk about right now how it's going to be taxed. I don't think that's sensible. I think we've got to be in preservation mode now, preserving jobs, trying to keep businesses in operation. Of course, those long-term issues will be there and they need to be dealt with, but let's focus on the here and now. I would say the same applies to those issues around infrastructure. I mean, we're seeing so much changing. I've made no secret of the fact that, you know, in the longer term, I don't feel, for example, that the energy system is delivering the kind of transition that we need. You know, there does need to be substantial change there. But actually, we're seeing the pandemic impacting on that. We're seeing it having a significant impact on a number of the companies engaged in that sector, as well as in transport and many other areas. I mean, rail effectively now is pretty much a publicly run service in many cases, people could say, because of the influence of the pandemic. So yes, it's having an influence on everything, including on those policy questions.
Thank you. So just one specific thing on the nationalisations point. Is the process now, and I appreciate you explaining there is a kind of Labour Party process, but does that mean that there's a blank sheet of paper, that none of those planned nationalisations, rail, water, post, etc., national grid, are Labour Party policy now? I know it's slightly academic, but it's important to lots of people and lots of businesses.
No, of course, and obviously Keir Starmer at the time of the leadership election did say that he was committed to public control, but then there's big questions about how that can be delivered, and as I said, the context is a very, very different one. Certainly on this, as on other matters, we want to have an open dialogue with business, just as we want to have an open dialogue with other stakeholders. We want to hear from you. As I said, the current context means that many of these questions are put in a very, very different perspective to where they could have been before. But I actually also think that there's far more room, drawing on the kinds of joint working that we've seen between business and trade unions and the Conservative government. I think that's something that we need to build on as a Labour Party into the future as well.
And before I go back to Carolyn, just one final thing, at least no small thing I should say, is Carolyn mentioned at the top these different responses in the 4 nations of the UK. There's also the government's rollout of proposals on next steps on devolution. These clearly have big impacts on business because they're working to different sets of rules in different places and often across different places. How do you think government should approach that issue?
I think it's very important indeed that there is trust between the governments operating in the different devolved nations, that there are early discussions around different policy changes that may be coming up. I think we haven't always seen that, unfortunately, during the course of this pandemic. On some issues we have, on others we haven't. And it does need to happen into the future. I mean, of course, there will be some policy variation. That's within the gift of the devolved nations. That's their right constitutionally. But I think where we can avoid too much variation, it's really, really important, because for businesses, particularly where there may already be some ambiguity around guidelines, something that I've spoken about quite a lot. When you've already got that ambiguity and then you see different systems in different nations, that really would be making life very, very difficult for different companies. Of course, potentially localized restrictions as well layered on top of that. So the potential for quite a lot of confusion for businesses, which is the opposite of what we need to have right now.
Annalise, thank you. Genuinely, thank you. It's really interesting to get the chance to listen and understand some length, how Labour thinking is changing, policy is changing, and the proposals, particularly around job support and business support. I'm just going to finish, if I can, with you, Carolyn. I'm struck by the fact that in March, April, May, almost by mistake, we developed an order of service for these conversations. You would discuss access to capital and business support, then we would go through the details of JRS, then we would go through which businesses should stay open and which ones would need to close. It feels as though we're back to that order of service in a number of ways. And I just wondered now, when you think sort of the next steps for the CBI, what needs to be communicated to government and shared with businesses, what's your agenda on that?
Yeah, absolutely. James, I'm going to say one thing before I say that, which is just to say that in terms of our relationship with the Labour Party, we have absolutely felt that change in tone since April. And the communication, I think, between the Shadow Cabinet and the CBI has been really striking. We've had over 50 meetings. We talk regularly to you, Annalise, to Ed and to Keir. There are things that we're going to want to really pick up on. I think the nationalisation agenda has been a major concern, and particularly if we want a green recovery that really works, it's going to need to be a public-private partnership of historic proportions. So, but to say how grateful we are, I think, for that new relationship, and we will be doing our part to make it really work. The agenda for next week is incredibly clear. I have to say, the successor to the job retention scheme is of paramount importance. The extension of the civils and the loan scheme as part of that. How we get the spending review really focusing on the right things. I think that's going to be, we're talking a lot about the green recovery, because actually, what are the two things that are the biggest priority for the autumn? It is protecting jobs and stimulating investment. Those are the two big priorities. So we will be doing that, James. We would really welcome hearing from anybody on the call about what they think about those priorities. Do mark our card. Anything you disagree with, any suggestions you have, how these changes are going to affect you. We are hugely in listening mode right now. And the one final thing I would say, James, is that our communication into government is very good. I mean, they are listening. I think we can make a real difference. But the more it is informed by real on-the-ground business experience, the better. It's a moment to really hear from people on the call. That would be great.
Karen, thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. A big thank you, Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, Karen Fairburn, as ever, thank you. We hold these calls twice a week, back next Monday, CBI at 10 and Wednesday too. Please join us then. But as Carolyn says, do go to the CBI website, do communicate the experiences you're having. They're incredibly important in informing the conversation with government and with businesses too. But for now, have a very good day, everyone. Thanks so much.